I don't see it on here. Did you?
Refresh.
Okay.
And then when you guys are ready, you can start. So I got you on Facebook and recording and also the radio. So you just
Okay. You ready? All right, I'm ready.
go ahead. I don't have no music.
Okay, so just go.
Okay.
Okay.
Sorry.
Just welcome everyone. That's
Hi,
all right.
everyone. Thanks for listening to Brainstorms on Hamilton Radio, sponsored by the Jerry Petito Show. Here with my co-host, Elena Malfi.
Hello.
As usual. Today we're going to be talking about bipolar disorder with Tony Roberts. He is the author of a book called Delight in Disorder, Ministry, Madness, Mission. Tony was a pastor for many years while battling his bipolar disorder, and his view on mental illness as it relates to God is pretty refreshing. It's very interesting, and I think it's very insightful. He also has a blog, delightindisorder.org, and is part of a podcast at revealingvoices.com. So we're talking about specifically bipolar disorder today, but I think his points of view can really apply to anyone who's going through a hard time, how he thinks of God and how a lot of people think God abandoned them or he's, mad or angry and doing something to hurt them, but I think his point of view is very unique, and I think it's very helpful to people who are going through a difficult time.
So we don't need a trigger warning on this. He had some
He will
serious
talk
mental.
about his suicide attempt. I'm not going to say what it was. If you're worried about that, then you might want to stop listening, and we can put later on where he says that in the show, so you can skip that part after the show's over. I'll put it in the comments, and then you can watch the whole thing and just skip over the time that he talks about that.
But most likely it's going to be uplifting.
It is very
not
uplifting.
The detail
No.
of that attempt.
He'll tell us what happened, but
Okay.
it's not upsetting. I don't
The
think.
point is not to be graphic.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he's going to call in very soon, and he's been battling bipolar disorder for I think 30 years. While he was a pastor, he was going through, mania and depression, and it's actually really inspiring the way he kept going. I mean, he had a lot of troubles and a lot of problems, but he always came back to, believing and hoping God would help him. So I think that's a really great message.
That is. So
go ahead.
Go ahead.
So he's going to call in about 5 minutes, and we'll talk to him. And his blog is also great. He wrote a blog post yesterday. He mentioned us. If you go to delightsindisorder.org, you can see it. He talks about dealing with suicide. So I don't think it needs a trigger warning, but if you're really worried about that, then you might want to not look at that particular post. But he mentions brainstorms, and he mentions one of the questions that I have that I'm going to ask him today about dealing with suicide.
Did you get any feedback from anyone that was negative? I'm just curious. You post who your guest is and what we're going to be talking about ahead of time, because everyone is not happy to talk about their relationship with God.
Yeah, I think he talks about in the book even people who don't believe in God. He doesn't say anything bad about them, and he says even they can be helpful. I think he said
by his philosophy.
Yeah,
perhaps?
I think he said he had a counselor, who was an atheist, and he was very helpful. And meanwhile, he had another counselor who was very religious, and he didn't help him at all. So,
interesting.
Yeah. Sorry, my throat is all scratchy. So I want to just say one of the quotes he has in his book, which I think is one of my favorites. God does not always relieve our suffering, but God does hear us when we call out and respond with comforting love. The question is, will we acknowledge and receive God's comfort, or have things gotten so bad that our soul refuses to be comforted, which is a quote. Our soul refuses to be comforted from the Bible. So I think that's a really nice, like, you still have to try, even when you think God is going to help you. You have to put effort into it anyway.
Right.
It's not just going to be like magic.
I told you this story before. I worked with, when you were in the throes of your bipolar disorder, and other members of the family were having problems as well. There was a woman with a very, very sad childhood and different things that had happened to her, and she was struggling a lot where I worked. And she asked me one day, I didn't seek people out and preach to them, but she just saw I was a pretty cheerful person and helping others, and she knew some of the things that were going on in my family at the time, and she asked me, how can you do that? You know, how she said she was mad at God. She was angry with God, and she didn't understand.
Oh, we have him.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
We'll pick that up
Tony
later.
Roberts calling in right now, our guest. Hello? Hello?
Should be there.
Tony?
Hello,
Hello?
caller.
Oh, hi.
Yes.
There you are. Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good. How are you doing?
Seems like we have an echo here.
Oh. I don't hear it
not-
over here. Can you hear me?
Okay, it's not coming through.
Can you
It's fine. I can
Okay.
hear
Okay.
you.
Okay, great. So I want to talk. I just introduced, you and what your book is basically about and everything. So we want to talk mostly about your book today, also your experiences. So I'm going to just start the questions right away. And I want you to just familiarize everyone with what bipolar disorder is, because we've talked about it before. I have bipolar disorder, but people are just tuning in. They might not know exactly.
Wait, you have to introduce me. I haven't met
Oh,
Tony.
this is Elena. She is my co-host.
Hello, Tony.
Hi, Elena. How are you?
Good, thanks. How are you?
I'm good.
Megan has
And
read.
what brings you to the table of mental health?
Well, I'm usually Megan's co-host, and I'm also her mom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
So you have a vested interest.
Absolutely.
Great.
So what were you going to say something?
I was going to say. I lost it. I'm
Okay.
sorry.
So I want you to tell everyone exactly what bipolar disorder is, and then how it specifically affected you. Can you do that?
Yes, I will. Well, thank you for having me on the program, and I will do my best to represent myself and others with bipolar and mental illness.
Yeah.
Bipolar is a really wide-ranging illness. It is a brain disease, so that's important to clarify at the beginning. It's not poor parenting or spiritual flaw. All of those can aggravate, but essentially it is a brain disease, brain disorder, and it represents actually the old term manic depression is a better descriptor in that it shows the radical swings between mania, which is heightened frenetic energy, euphoria, those kinds of things, to depression, which is almost like a despair where you can't do anything. The two kinds of bipolar I'm familiar with, and there are all kinds of subcategories, but essentially bipolar 1 or 2. One is more radical mood swings where you would go from high highs and low lows throughout your life repeatedly. Bipolar 2, you have more aggressive depression, but fewer manic episodes.
And
So
you
in some
have
ways, that's more.
You have bipolar 1?
I do, yeah. And I have other adjectives to go with it, like with psychotic features and rapid mood swings, rapid cycling, and those kinds of things.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I just want to clarify the euphoric highs of mania that you're talking about. People picture that as someone who stays up all night to write an opera or create wonderful things, but it's not always a pleasant experience, correct?
No, not at all. It can be, and sometimes it is, but sometimes it can be so challenging.
It can be agitating.
I know for me, sometimes the inability to sleep and my brain racing has led to all kinds of anxiety and fears and paranoia. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually have I have bipolar 2, and the hypomania I get is actually usually, well, sometimes it's, euphoria, but sometimes it's anger, which I think a lot of people don't know that that's a possibility with bipolar disorder as well. So.
Yeah. That's a very good point.
Yeah, that's much less pleasant.
And it can be very irritating and.
Yeah, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So, can you tell us a little bit about your specific experiences?
Well, sure. I have been in the mix of symptoms since I was 13, but I only was diagnosed at age 30.
Wow.
And that's when
wow. That's a lot of years dealing with that, all kinds of things, and not being able to treat it probably well because it wasn't identified. I'm sorry to hear that. That's terrible.
Yeah, in some ways you're absolutely right. I did certain things like self-medicate. I found ways to cope, but it was a harsh time. I've asked some psychiatrists since, how was it that the moods were masked for so long, and they've said everything from like my athletic pursuits gave me certain levels of hormones that offset it. Certainly my drinking and drug use was a self-medicating feature. And also, I grew up, I was born in 1964, and, it really wasn't until the new generation of antipsychotics like Prozac, and those came on the market, which wasn't until 1990, 91, that people were beginning to look at the fact that, this was something you could treat with medicine. So I passed through that. My first experience in terms of seeking out help was through group therapy. So yeah, it was tough, but yeah, I've had my first significant episode was when I was a pastor and I was a new father, had 2 children, and I had a manic episode due to a change in medication. And it became, I was up 5 nights and days, and started having visions and voices.
Yeah, I think you will after being up days like that.
Oh, sleep deprivation is just, as you may know, it's just really a drag. It's really risk.
Yeah.
And I went in the hospital. Fortunately, I was never resistant to treatment, and I went in the hospital, and they diagnosed me then. But before I was diagnosed, and this is described a little bit in my book, I had an aggressive episode on the unit. I believed that I had a special mission to break out and get people into the unit to safely protect themselves from the end of the world. So I tried to break out and was subdued, and in the course of being subdued kind of fought back. So that's very, all of that I was blocked out.
That's very interesting to me, because we read a lot, hear a lot in the news about people with untreated mental disorders that sometimes behave that way. Sometimes they're homeless. Sometimes it's an engagement with or an altercation with the police. And there's sometimes criticism of how that's handled. So it's very interesting to talk to someone like yourself who remembers that. You're not hallucinating right now, but you remember that experience, what it felt like. You really believed what you thought was happening was happening. And you do
Yeah.
remember that?
I do. I remember all the way up to the point where they were, injecting me with the medication, and I blacked out.
And
Yeah.
later on, were you able to recall what you had been feeling then, but you still knew it hadn't been real?
Later on, yeah, I was able to tap into the memory, but I knew it was deception. Yeah, it was
Wow.
not reality that I was cognizant of.
Do you have any advice for someone, let's say they have a family member in their home that is in the process of being diagnosed, that maybe has episodes like that? Do you have any small piece of advice at all as to how to best handle a situation like that? Let's say I had a grown son, that was agitated and angry, and I didn't want him to leave the house or whatever it was he was going to do. Is there anything that you can think of that might have had an effect on you, gotten you to calm down, or
Right.
or no?
Well, in my experience, faith played a large role, and my wife and I shared a strong faith, and so we did a lot of praying as a method to both discern what was reality and not reality, and also to just calm down the situation. And we called in people. I went to a couple's house who were in their 70s, who were very had a lot of spiritual maturity, and they prayed with me and helped me calm down. But ultimately, that didn't work alone. I had to also seek psychological help, and so I think, if I'm hearing you correctly in terms of a loved one's response, I think what I would advise would be a method of calming, not trying to exasperate the situation with anxiety, which is easier said than done. I mean, if somebody's threatening violence, obviously you can't.
My first,
you may have to call the authorities.
My first instinct would be not to agitate them further. It would be to, okay, tell me about what you need to do, and just, not confront them, not challenge what they're saying they believe.
That's an excellent point.
That would be my
I
instinct.
think my sister is a psych nurse, and she always says you never challenge anyone's psychosis.
Yep.
It's just, you're going to lose, and they're going to become more paranoid.
Yeah.
Well, that's good. That's good advice.
Because they think you're part of it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to ask if you can explain the title of your book, "Delight in Disorder," because I think you explain it in your book, but I think it's might be confusing to some people. Those two words seem to be oxymorons. So.
Exactly. Well, I found a poem by Robert Herrick, written in the 19th century, about a dress. And it talks about how this dress is beautiful in its imperfection. And the title of the poem is Delight in Disorder. And I chose the poem, or the title, because of the paradox. I felt like it's both a prescriptive and a descriptive. Prescriptively, the discipline of being bipolar, having bipolar disorder, is to find delight in spite of it. So how do we find delight in disorder? And then descriptively, I believe that through my faith that God is someone who is with us in our darkest moments. So there is delight already in disorder. And then my subtitle actually came through a friend in terms of Ministry Madness Mission. It was describing the progression for me between serving in pastoral ministry to having a psychotic episode,
Yeah.
and then blending the two in a mission that reaches out for both.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's I really like that poem in the beginning of the book. I read that and I thought it seemed to apply a little bit, like you said. So I did want to know. There's a quote in your book, and it's from the Bible, and it says, "Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus." And then you specify that it says, "Give thanks in all circumstances, not for all circumstances." Can you explain the difference?
Sure. The giving thanks in all circumstances is, again, more of a description. All of us are going to have bad circumstances, or I should say challenging circumstances in our lives. And we do have a choice there to become bitter or accept these as vehicles or opportunities to grow.
Yeah.
So in those moments where we are afflicted, it's important to give thanks to God in spite of our circumstances.
Yeah.
However, it's asking too much, and I don't think it's something God expects of us, to actually thank God for a circumstance.
Yeah.
I mean, clearly, you raised a question, I think, of me earlier about, not earlier here, but before, about, the suicide of a loved one. I mean, certainly, we should never expect someone at any point in time to give thanks to God for the suicide of a loved one.
Right.
Of course.
That's theologically cruel and just wrong. However, when we give thanks in all circumstances, again, kind of like delight in disorder,
Yeah.
we discipline ourselves to find the delight in spite of the disorder.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, I really liked that. Made a lot of sense to me, and I think that's a good way to still be a little bit positive about things, even when things are going wrong.
Can I tell my little story
Yeah.
at this point?
Yeah.
I was saying right before you joined us, Tony, that I used to work at a place, and there was a woman there who had a lot of struggles, and she knew some of my family history, what I was going through. And she came to me one day and asked me, "How do you stay so positive?" And she believed in God, but she told me she was angry with God for certain things that he had allowed. And I just told her the way I look at it is, I have children. They might grow up and do things that I don't approve of. They might get sick. They might suffer, but I had them anyway. If you want total control over someone or something, you get a pet. So why would God be any different? God has the angels in heaven. They don't sin. They're not physical beings. They're not ever going to get sick with anything, with cancer, with mental illness. But you have your children knowing that they're going to be human, things can happen to them, but that you'll be there for them when those things happen, and you love them. And I think
that's a great analogy.
Thank you. And it really made her, she really liked that. She really, really did.
Yeah. I like that too. I think I remember that.
I probably told you about it.
Yeah, I think you did. I also wanted to talk about, well, in different religions, a lot of time people don't really believe that a mental disorder is something that's, genetically wrong, or it's caused from sin, or it's caused from not believing in God enough, or not trying hard enough. So you say there's a difference between sickness and sin, which I believe, and I think a lot of people don't think they're doing something wrong, and that's why they got sick.
You think people think they're doing something wrong?
Yeah, or other people tell them, "Oh, well, you sinned, so now you're getting the consequences," which I don't think is obviously true. Can you just explain? I mean, you're a pastor, or you were a pastor, so I'm sure you've had to help people when they think.
Consequences come at the pearly gates.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, what I will say is I think there's a grave misunderstanding about sin. There's really sin refers to two almost opposite categories. There's the condition of sin, which is what we inherit, what used to be or sometimes still is called the original sin. And then there's the commission of sin, the things we do to aggravate our lives and further separate us from God. Mental illness is definitely a condition of sin. It's something it's a brokenness that we have inherited. And even if you look at it scientifically, you could say that it's a genetic flaw. It's a brain disease. But unfortunately, in a modern culture, especially beyond the church, but even within the church, we've come to see the word sin as something the church uses to cruelly control people with shame. It's not that at all with mental illness. It's a brain disease that afflicts us, and while we can exasperate it with our behavior, it's overly simplified at best to say that sinful behavior leads to suicide. But the thought or sinful behavior leads to mental illness. It's a thought that's pervasive. I have a friend, he's grew up as a Christian, now he practices Hinduism or Buddhism, and he says, look, I use drugs excessively, and that led to my mental illness. And there are, those in all faiths who try to get an equation to say, A plus B equals C. And it's just not that easy.
Well, I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is the stigma associated with mental illness. Even in a family where religion is not discussed, where maybe God is not discussed, it's hard for people to understand mental illness. And a lot of people, if parents don't understand, they're apt to think it's a weakness in the person, that they just can't deal with things, when that's not the case. Sometimes I think parents feel guilty. Perhaps they had similar troubles in their lives. And as parents, if we feel we had anything to do with a shortcoming in our children, you would think we'd be the perfect person to help that child. But we're not, because we're not objective, because we're so upset with ourselves, that it came from us. But I also think people are afraid. They're afraid of any illness, of course, but mental illness is scary. You don't know, if you want to avoid cancer, you can eat a healthy diet, you can get a lot of testing, screening done with whatever might run in your family. You're worried about heart disease, you can get a lot of exercise. But mental illness, the way others view it, someone just comes down with it. And I think it's frightening to them to think that could happen to anyone. So I think that's partly why some people...
They try to attribute it to other things.
Yeah, I do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I do think it's biologically, I think probably we're all biologically disposed to different disorders, mental and physical.
Right.
And perhaps stress can trigger that, can activate it, can bring it out. Stress of different kinds. That's my personal belief.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense.
I think you're right.
Yeah. Okay, I want to talk, we're going to talk about your suicide attempt. So if anyone feels uncomfortable listening to this, you can stop listening right now. So you mentioned your suicide attempt in your book, and I would just like you to explain what happened and how you felt and how you kind of came to peace with it a little bit, and how you feel it relates to God.
Yeah. Yeah, I will echo what you said that, some people, this is a trigger, so, tune this out. I'll not give graphic descriptions by any means, but, it's, every case of persons who attempt suicide is different.
Yeah.
Sometimes the media and others assume, everybody who attempts suicide had a lifelong struggle with depression, and they had given up hope and they lost faith, and they create a profile that often doesn't fit the person at all.
Yeah.
In my case, it was a very specific attack. I was walking home from my work at church. It was a Saturday night. I felt I had the flu symptoms coming on, so I called someone to fill in for me Sunday. I thought it would be good to drink some tea, go to bed. So I was going to bed, said goodnight to my children, went to bed, and then suddenly I heard a voice that said, "It's okay." And many people, even if you heard a voice that wasn't, that was a hallucination, might believe that was reassurance that things would be okay. But for whatever reason, in my deranged mind, I thought the voice meant it's okay to attempt suicide. Mm-hmm. And so, I got up and had some pretty potent psychotropics and took them. And in my case, obviously, it didn't result in death. But in terms of God, I will say this, what in my case, I thought what I heard at that moment was the voice of God. Mm-hmm. In my deranged mind. Mm-hmm. Looking back, of course, I see it as precisely the opposite. Mm. This was the enemy pretending to be God. Yeah. And so, but in terms of where God was in the event, in the aftermath, I clearly seen God working through my ex-wife, my doctors to lead to recovery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you say it's, I can't remember the exact words, but it's like a disservice. That's a bad explanation, but to try to take your life because God, gave it to you, and you're being ungrateful. So, mm-hmm. But you also said it kind of brought you closer to God.
Yep.
So can you explain that?
Yeah, sure. The first thing I want to say is that the assumption many people make that suicide is the unforgivable sin is absolutely incorrect. Yeah. Biblically, it is not referring to suicide when it talks about the unforgivable sin. Mm-hmm. However, on a very basic level, God gives us life, and to end our lives or attempt to end our lives on our own is, an act of ingratitude. Yeah. And yet somehow, for some reason, God chose to give me another chance. Why God chose to do that for me and not for everyone is part of the mystery of grace. And as a result of that, it's my job, as I see it, to share my story so people can know that even those of us who have taken this step of attempting suicide, we are not rejected by God. Yeah. No. God can bring us back into the fold. And there are a lot of people who have attempted suicide that are living and that could be listening here, and many of them either feel abandoned by God or whatever feeling they have, but there's more distance. And I want my testimony, my story, to serve as a way to draw people back to faith.
Yeah.
My personal belief has always been that healthy human beings have an instinct of self-preservation of their life. So if someone attempts to take their life, in my mind, they are not really of completely sound mind and body, because your natural instinct is to preserve your life. So I think it's possible someone can be suffering in different ways, whether physical or mental, where they're just seeking relief from that. Or I never even thought of, like what you said, hallucinations, where you believe it. And,
Right.
God knows that. God knows what's going through everybody's mind. But I do have a text from someone who wants to be anonymous. He is late 20s right now. When he was younger, an older sibling did commit suicide, unfortunately. And he wants to know if you have got any words of comfort for the families who,
Boy,
that's a tough one.
Yeah,
because
it's tough, and it's tough, and it's also very important to address, because families are the ones who suffer the most, families and loved ones. What I will say to you is, first of all, do not blame yourself.
Right.
The decision or the events that lead to suicide, whether it's the person's choice or the person's choice impacted by the factors of mental illness or hallucination, say nothing about what you have done or failed to do.
Right.
There's a story, actually an event that happened. Rick Warren, who wrote The Purpose-Driven Life, his son Matthew died by suicide. And
I didn't know that.
in the description of what he said was that the family had gathered around and were playing board games and everything, and Matthew just went upstairs and took his own life. They had done everything from seeking out the best help available. Clearly they had done all they could to bring about help. But sometimes, again, coming back to family members, sometimes things are beyond your control. And the best you can do now is, I would say, to comfort others, I have a good friend whose son died by suicide, and she's now an active advocate for families and persons with mental illness who face this similar issue. So,
and that's another.
So tell your story.
That's another reason to try and remove stigma, so that people seek help, so that when something terrible like what we're talking about happens, families aren't afraid to talk about it and don't feel guilt. They have enough grief and sorrow to deal with. We don't want guilt added onto that as well. And I noticed that you mentioned people who have died by suicide, and I like that phrasing. I know the trend right now is to not say that someone committed suicide, because that sounds like a very level-headed, intentional act.
Like it was a crime.
Yeah, or like it was a crime. They died by suicide, whatever was related to that, whether it was mental illness, like you said, hallucinations, drugs, whatever. Yeah. So thank you for saying that.
It is hard, and I was taught that after I wrote the book, and so I may have made the mistake within the book of talking in the old language, but we do our best to basically be honest, to tell our story in the most respectful way.
Yeah, it sounds very natural as you say it as well.
I don't even think you even said committed suicide in the book. I don't recall reading that. So, but
okay.
I was wondering, there's a lot of quotes in your book, whether from the Bible or from different literature. Do you have a favorite one?
I will draw on the one that became my guiding verse, and when I sign my autograph on a autograph book, I always include this verse, and that is, delight yourself in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. And when I chose that around the time I wrote the book or published the book, I focused on delight because I was having a really hard struggle after my suicide attempt into my period of going on to disability and then separation from my wife and family. I was having a really hard time believing that I should or could experience delight. And so that was my regular prayer. And God really helped me through those very dark times to have moments of delight. I won't say, I became, on top of the world, but I had moments of delight.
Yeah.
So then I shifted my prayer to the second part of the verse in terms of the desires of my heart. And I've come to see that it doesn't mean that if we give God praise, we're always going to get what we want. That's not what the verse is talking about. It's that our desires will come to resemble what is best for us and what God desires for us. But it's okay to pray the deepest desires of your heart, and then God will shape those into what's best.
I also think sometimes when people, the deepest desires of your heart is not going to be money and things. And if people pray for a raise or to win the lottery or to have debt magically erased or whatever they might be praying about related to money, to things, it's not necessarily the concrete thing that they're looking for. It's the peace that comes with it, maybe, that they're looking for, the relief of stress, or I think it's more feelings. So you can pray for a certain thing, and God might not give you that thing, but He might change your point of view or have things change just enough that you get those positive feelings that you're looking for. We talked about that, you and I, over the years. As with your illness, there were things you weren't able to do.
I remember someone said one time, God always answers your prayers. It's just not always a yes or something like that. He doesn't always say yes to what you're exactly asking for.
Precisely.
Yeah, I like that.
Good point, Megan.
So I did want to ask you about this quote in your book as well. You say God's idea of healing is often quite different from our own. So that I think that is very profound, and I think it might confuse people because there's only one type of healing, right? It's just getting better. But what would you say God's idea of healing would be?
Well, it's an excellent question, Megan, and I'm glad you brought that out. It's true that when we pray, a lot of times in our prayers in church or beyond the church, you look at Facebook and people talk about, I'm going for surgery tomorrow, please pray that, and the implication is that, the surgery is successful and I will be back to the way I was and even better. However, I'll speak as someone with mental illness, sometimes that's neither possible. Let me back up. It's always possible. In God, nothing is impossible, but it's not always the best to return to the way we were. So sometimes the best thing.
I'm sorry, that's interesting. You said the best, because there have been times when someone I knew or someone asked me to pray for someone who was very, very ill, and it really was not looking good. So, of course, you'd love for them to just fully recover, but intellectually, that maybe that's not likely. And I would always pray for the person whatever's best for them, and God knows what that is. So it's interesting you said the best.
And when we talk about healing, God in Scripture talks about shalom, and shalom is in the Hebrew, it's a sort of healing, but it's more than just physical healing. It's more like well-being, and it has more to do with relationships. So instead of being like physically able to function for a desired purpose, like going back to work or doing certain pleasurable things, shalom and well-being is to be able to enter into a deeper relationship with God and with others. And sometimes the path of doing that is to not be physically the same as we were. I was a chaplain for a while, and I met a lot of people on the heart unit who worked themselves nearly to death.
Wow.
And they needed to have a physical limitation put in their lives in order to straighten out their lives. And you look at the Apostle Paul, and he talks about the thorn in his flesh. I don't know what that thorn is. Scholars disagree on it, but clearly it was a limitation that was put in his life so that he could better serve the Lord and love people.
Yeah, I think I have, I kind of can relate to that, because when I was getting sick, I would just, wish and pray I could go back to how I was. But thinking about it now, how I was not really the healthiest person I could be. I was doing too much, and I was doing things I didn't even really want to do. So I'm very thankful now that I just calmed down and I'm just doing what I feel is the right thing to do. I wouldn't have half of the things I have now, not this radio show, not my nonprofit that I run, if I didn't just, let God guide me instead of, I was trying so hard at some point. Yeah. Remember?
You were trying to control everything, and you were trying to find your accomplishments in perfection.
Yeah, I was just forcing myself to do too much and to be perfect, and it was actually detrimental instead of being, it wasn't rewarding in any way. So I think that's a very good point.
I thought you couldn't handle the littlest failure, so you got a big one.
Yeah, that's funny. That is funny.
Yep. Good point.
You talk about pills and prayer, so a lot of people in different religious circles don't always believe in medication, but you do?
I do, yes, and I believe very firmly. We have a support group that's faith-based, peer-led, a bunch of things, and we strongly advise people to both seek out psychiatric care, maintain their medication, seek out therapy, whatever. And I believe it is a divine method to give us these healing persons. It's imperfect. I will be the first to admit, my medicine when I was first diagnosed from the ages of like 30 till I was about 48, they tried nearly 50 medicines to find the right ones.
Yeah.
And that's not uncommon. Sometimes, there are terrible side effects.
Yeah.
That's very common. But it's a calculated risk you take, and I think it's one that people of faith need to consider. On the other hand, medicine is not the sole approach to getting better. And in fact, if we look at it that way, we're bound to get worse. I think we need to have, prayer has been proven scientifically or shown in many studies to have a positive impact. And as a person of faith, I know the value of prayer to to promote my own sanity and to draw on the strength of and wisdom of God to seek healing with the resources that that God has given me.
I would like to tell you a real short story because you've touched on
Yeah.
the subject of medicine, Megan, so you know I'm going to say something. I had a little girl with some severe depression that I felt was serious enough was going to need medication. And she had to hang on and wait for the appointment with the appropriate doctors and psychiatrists. And then even when she was prescribed medicine, you have to wait for it to take effect. And she was little. And I remember telling her, medicine is not going to fix everything, but your range of despair is so low that normal intellectual mental coping strategies just can't work. The medicine will maybe rein that in to an area where
That will work.
positive thinking and counseling and will work. And in her case, I do think both were necessary. But I have heard objections from people who, so the pharmaceutical industry does not always have the best reputation with different things. I have heard people, that they had a bad experience with a medicine or a side effect or a story they read about the pharmaceutical industry. That has nothing to do with the months Megan spent discussing symptoms, seeing a counselor, seeing a psychiatrist, trying a medicine, very gradually building up to it and a certain dosage. And if she says it's working and she feels it's necessary, then I respect that. And I wish...
Exactly. Megan is really the expert on, on your own health. And where I think prayer can be beneficial as well is that there are so many options in medication now. And as your personal advocate, Megan, as you discuss and discern what's going on in your health, prayer can help you articulate that. The doctors can hear that and respond better.
Now she's always prayed, and the little girl who is not Megan that I'm talking about was very very God loving, very very prayerful as well. And as we had to wait, and she really had to suffer with how she was feeling and not being able to function until things got a little better. Part of that was prayer. Part of it was also just common sense knowledge of medicine takes a while to work and all that. But definitely part of that was prayer. And if someone else tells me that I don't need medicine, I don't want medicine, I just, have counseling, or here's what I do. Well, here's what I say. And I know someone like that who's got a very structured routine and things to take care of his health, and he does not take medicine. And he seems very happy and well and at peace, and he's functional. But if someone tells me, well, I don't, I think the pharmaceutical industry is in cahoots with the doctors, and, I don't trust any of it, but they're not well, I don't think that's too good. I think maybe they should maybe, do they not want to get well? Are they self-medicating? Which you can't say you don't want to treat. There's side effects to recreational drugs and alcohol as well. So, I think people should be more respectful than they are about people who choose to take medicine and the stigma. I think there should not be such a stigma associated with that.
That's right.
I just thought of a question because we were talking about prayer and praying for whatever's best. People talk about God's will. I think some people feel like, okay, what's the point of even praying for anything, because isn't what God wants to happen just going to happen anyway? So
I think that's a fair question when people raise that, and for that reason, many people, myself included, would not say at the end of a prayer, if it is your will, because it does soften the request. If you look at the prayers in the Psalms, they don't include that within the prayer often. There are some, and certainly the Lord's prayer includes "Thy will be done," but the thing, and I can't remember who said this, I think it was Soren Kierkegaard, but it was something like, prayer does not change God, it changes us.
Yep.
And there is a sense in which, as we articulate prayer, we are the ones that become more in line with God's will. And out of that, we discover what more we can do to produce, to produce the results, to cooperate with God for the kinds of results that are best.
I was going to sum that.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Ultimately, it is God's will, and God knows best. But we don't always participate in that will.
Yeah.
I was going to sum that up when Megan asked the question. I was thinking in my head, well, if God's will is going to be done, regardless, if his will is going to be done with you or without you, you might want to get on board. You'll be happier.
Yeah.
It's how do you want to live in opposition to it, and there's no peace then.
Yeah, I really like that. That's true. I did want to talk about, you talk about being forgiven for your sins by God, but you still have consequences for your actions. And you said you were talking with your counselor, this was a few years ago when you wrote the book, but talking about the difference between penance and repentance. Can you kind of talk about that, and what is the difference?
I will. It's interesting. I wrote the book, I wrote the book over the last 10 years, but I published in 2014, and I haven't gone back and read it frequently, but you've pointed to something I conveniently forgot. I had to review it, and part of it is it's a very painful thing. When I wrote that, I was going through my separation with the woman to be my ex-wife, and I was in intensive counseling to try to resolve in my own mind, what I had done wrong, what I needed to do to reconcile, and how on earth we could get back together. And my therapist at the time, a Christian counselor, saw that I was really beating myself up about this and challenged me to consider that perhaps, I'm trying to pay penance over sins that I may or may not have committed, instead of repenting and behaving in ways that were life-affirming. And it was not a revelation for another 3 years, but through that conversation I had, I was able to let go, and the unfortunate result is that I am divorced now. But I will say that my capacity to move forward and live in forgiveness is greater now than when I was paying penance.
That's good.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Versus beating yourself up over something. Yeah, I like that a lot.
Yeah. And that relates to the mental illness because, it's often the case that there are certain things beyond our control. Certainly we're responsible for our own behaviors, but, there are also certain things that we can and can't do. And that puts a tremendous strain on marriages and relationships in general. It's not a coincidence that over 90% of persons with bipolar wind up in a divorce if they're married.
Sure.
Yeah.
It's just a tough thing to do.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yep.
I just want to say, as there's a pause here for a second, that I happen to be, I'm a Christian, I happen to be Roman Catholic. So when I hear someone is a pastor, not to be a hypocrite and have stigma, but Megan told me about this great book by this pastor. When I hear pastor, I think, okay, pastor, did he go to school? Did he just build a church in his backyard? What's the credentials of this person?
Right.
But what she told me about your book and hearing you speak, I'm so impressed with the consistency and intelligence of everything you have to say. I cannot wait to get your
Yeah.
book.
Well,
Megan has read it.
She hasn't read it.
Megan has read it. I have not
I'm
yet.
grateful for that. And I did receive a master's degree and other advanced degrees, and we did study with priests. So
Yeah, you mentioned, you said
so,
original sin. I was like, where's my Catholic friends at Facebook? Get on here. We think we're the only ones in heaven, the Catholics.
No.
Sure, that's right.
There's that.
We all do.
There's that joke. St. Peter's showing someone around, and they get to a big wall, and they have to talk quietly. And the newcomer to heaven says, "Why do we have to talk so quietly?" And St. Peter says, "The Catholics are on that side of the wall, and they think they're the only ones here."
Yeah.
Right. Exactly.
We made Jean laugh back there.
I have another quote here. I have so many quotes from your book because there were so many great ones. You say, "My moods do not determine my reality." And you talk about how whatever mood you're in, it will eventually change, which that's what I always go to when I'm feeling, depressed or whatever I'm feeling. It will not stay this way forever. So how do you kind of remind yourself of that if you're depressed or going through a rough time?
Yeah. Well, I imagine the struggle is even greater for you with bipolar 2 because you have lengthy periods of depression, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
Typically my range is a matter of as little as a few hours all the way up to a few weeks. So it's very rare for me to have one emotional state for even longer than a month. Usually I'm depressed, very depressed, but only for a week, and then I have a level. Well, I don't really have a level area, but go into hypomania and mania. But yeah, I mean it's taken me over 20 years, but I've come to just ride the roller coaster.
Yeah.
Know that it's not going to always be pleasant. Since I've been on disability, it's easier because I don't have the same number of fixed commitments to have to meet expectations of others, and I can do more when I am able to, and then when I'm not able to, I can not feel bad about it. I'll just
That's right.
I know it'll come around.
Yeah.
But it's harder for people. I know it was harder for me when I was in pastoral ministry, when I was a father of 4 children and, at home and leader in the community and all of that. And you raised the question about consistency. I think to be consistent in our relations with others is exceedingly hard when you have bipolar.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Consistent in anything, really.
It is. You bet.
You mentioned you're on disability. That's what you said, right?
I am.
So, can you talk about how that's an appropriate thing? I mean, a lot of people think it is just for people with physical disabilities, but it's not.
We fully understand the need for that,
Yeah,
but
maybe you could
some
explain
people
Sure.
if you're able to, like.
Yeah, it was something I struggled with a long time. I was advised by my supervisors to go on to disability because I had tried so hard to avoid it, and it was basically consuming me. But yeah, in my case with bipolar, the level of functioning I have is debilitating to the degree that I can't safely, for my own sake, and effectively for others in a job, work what would be a full-time job or.
I'm going to stop you right there, Megan. Did you hear that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did you hear that, Megan?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Do you struggle with being on disability, Megan?
Well, I'm not on disability, but I want to just work full time and do everything like
Yeah.
But I'm really not able to. But then I get frustrated, and I'm like searching for jobs, and my mom's like, well, you can't even do that. How do you think you're going to do that?
Right.
So,
Well, I'll tell you this, and this gives a rather graphic picture of what I went through. I went on disability in 2009, and literally for the next 5 years, every single night, every single day, I had what was called vocation dreams. And every
Oh,
night I would dream of a different job that I should be able to do.
oh man.
that's
And I would
awful.
wake up in the morning and the sad reality would hit me that I can't do that job.
Yeah. Oh man.
But
And
you
I would
are
just really,
doing things, you know?
there's the transition that
Yeah.
people helped me to make, my therapists and good friends and family. Uh, I do have a ministry. Fortunately, I have some measure of income through a variety of sources. My productivity and my vocation is not like I don't have a salary or an hourly
Right.
rate to it, but I have enough to live on, and I'm productive in various ways. Like Megan said,
That's
with your
great.
not-for-profit and
Hmm.
your radio show. For me, I have a blog, a podcast, growing ministry, which is sort of like a counseling by phone and video, phone and those kind of things. Small group ministry, speaking in the community. Very few things I get paid for,
Right,
but
right.
the Bible doesn't say those who don't work for pay should not eat.
Yeah.
It just says those who don't work.
Yeah.
Um, I always like to point out to Megan, um, even if she ever has a tendency, not that she often does, to think that, feel sorry for herself that she has a mental disorder. People without mental disorders also struggle with, okay, I bit off more than I can chew. I'm doing too much that's good for my health or my family relationships or whatever. It's all relative in your life. It's not just.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned, Tony, being in the hospital with heart patients who worked themselves in there. They didn't,
Yep.
Yeah.
So
I
Hmm.
go to this one because we're almost out of
Oh,
time.
oh, okay. I was gonna say a different one. That's okay. You made a list in your book. It's kind of funny. It's time to leave your psychiatrist when he or she says. I just wanted you to go over maybe your two top. I know what my favorites were, but what were your favorites?
Okay. It's time to leave your psychiatrist when she says, enough about your mother, let's talk about mine.
Yeah, that was one of my favorite ones.
It's time to leave your psychiatrist when he says, if you want a taste of ECT, just stick your tongue on this car battery.
Yeah.
It's time to leave your psychiatrist when she says, before we treat your OCD, I'd like you to clean out my garage.
Yeah, that was it. That was my favorite.
It's time to time to leave your psychiatrist when he says, you think you've got problems. My Porsche has a flat tire. And then the final one that I liked a lot is, it's time to leave your psychiatrist when she says, I can see now why your wife wants to leave you.
Yeah. Those are so great.
Yeah,
Time
I
to get
think
a new one.
It's so important. It's so important when we have, for everyone, and especially when we have mental illness, because it's a very weighty subject, and because of the stigma and because of the self-stigma, we feel we don't have worth, and we take ourselves too seriously, and sometimes we just have to laugh at the absurdity of the situations we find ourselves
Yes,
in.
we have a wicked sense of humor, Megan and I, about these things. You have to. It's how you get through,
Yes,
And we're getting close to the end,
you
and
bet.
we want to do all the contact information and all that. But I think
Yeah,
You
at the
had
end of your
something
book,
else?
you talk about different books and movies that have to do with people with bipolar disorder or things like that. And some of them you said are very accurate. Some of them you said weren't, perfect, but can you mention maybe one or two things that you think are a good representation?
Or a bad
Yes,
one.
the
Or a bad one, yeah.
Right. The best one I would recommend is An Unquiet Mind by Kay Redfield Jamison.
Okay.
She happens to be a research psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins in the area of psychiatric disorders, especially bipolar. But more importantly, she has bipolar disorder.
Okay.
And her narrative in that memoir is phenomenal. It was the book that kept me going when I first read it, when I received my diagnosis. I've read it about 3 or 4 times since. Amazing book. And it gives, first of all, it's a very well-written book, which I appreciated as an English major, but it's also a heartfelt and inspiring story, not syrupy, not, Pollyanna-ish, but it gives hope. If I would say something to avoid, the book, the movie Silver Linings Playbook is,
I've heard mixed opinions on that.
It's a wonderful movie all the way to the very end, and then it puts on kind of a Hollywood twist, which totally discounts the struggle of the preceding hour and a half. However, if you read the book, I did go back and read the book. It handles it much differently. So it was kind of one of those Hollywood endings that they felt obligated to put on.
Yeah.
We are almost out of time.
I have one quote from you that I really like. I'm just going to read it. It is good to remember and appreciate the past as long as I don't try to recreate it in the present and wind up with no future at all. That was one of my favorite quotes in the whole thing. That's a good one. I really like that a lot. And
thank you.
Then one more quote, and then I'm gonna ask you to mention all your places people can read your book and all that stuff. Prayer may not always be a magic panacea to cure all ills. It is, however, a lifeline we can draw on when we are in distress, when there is no place else to go. Rather than make it an occasional retreat, why not make it our first line of defense?
That's beautiful.
I really like that a lot. That's a great one.
Thank you, Megan. Thank you.
And we have like 2 minutes left. I would like you to please mention your blog, your book, anything you want people to check out.
I'm going to check it all out, so mention it all very clearly.
Yes. Well, Delight in Disorder is my book, the subtitle Ministry Madness Mission. It is available on Amazon. However, I'm offering it from me with a signed autograph for just $10. And you can write to me on Tony@delightindisorder.org. So it's much better. Amazon, I think, is charging $14 with, and with shipping included, and you don't get my autograph. So, my blog is delightindisorder.org. So the same thing as my email address. And then I have a podcast that I co-host with Eric Riddle called Revealing Voices, and it's at revealingvoices.com. Just revealingvoices.com.
Okay.
When I first heard the name of your book, I thought, Delight in Disorder. He must have been to our house. But that's not what it was.
Well, it could be. I haven't visited you yet. So.
I want to say I actually got the ebook, and I suggest you get the real book because I wanted to highlight so many things in there. And I don't know how to. It was on my phone. I don't know if you can highlight things in your phone Kindle, but I was like, oh man, I should have gotten the real book. So.
Well, as a thank you, you send me your snail address, and I'll send you an autographed copy as a complimentary.
Thank you so much. That's so nice of you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here with us all this time.
Okay.
We really enjoyed talking to you, and I'm getting comments. People